John Ramos in full attention.
Thank you. Hello. So the expert couldn't make it. I have to be here. Sorry. Anyhow. Title of this is God Prefers You Never Forgive Anyone Ever. What? So we'll revisit that at the end, and hopefully it'll make some sense. But thinking about forgiveness, do you enjoy catching resentment? What about forgiving people? Is that your idea of a really good time? What if the 12 steps points us to a better way? How? Well, by helping us separate distorted stories from reality. So hurts, habits, hang-ups, addictions are almost always sustained by denial stories. And these denial stories act to justify us, excuse us, blame others, dismiss, and avoid. The Searching Fearless inventory of steps 4, 5, and 10 guides us through a process to identify and confront the denial stories. And this empowers us to accept facts and tell different stories that align with what we most value and want. We wrap facts of our lives in stories in order to give them meaning. And these stories feel real. They feel like facts. And when these stories involve a villain and a victim, they generate resentment and require forgiveness. But if we can learn to separate facts from stories, we can choose stories that allow us to skip resentment and forgiveness altogether. Proverbs 19:11, if you're sensible, other translations say wise, you will control your temper, and when someone wrongs you, it's a great virtue to ignore it. So going back to the title of the presentation, it doesn't say it's a great virtue to forgive them. It says ignore it. How do you do that? Well, let's talk about stories and facts and what's the difference. How can we tell if what we're thinking, what we're experiencing, how can we tell if it's a story? Facts are objective, observable, measurable, irrefutable. 100% of people, of unbiased observers, would agree with the fact. And facts can support many different meanings. Stories, on the other hand, are the meanings that we make of things. So it's the judgments we make, it's the virtues and defects of character that we assign to others. Basically, you don't have to waste time, though, wondering, or analyzing and all that, because to make it really simple, it's not a fact if there's any feelings associated with it. Facts have no feelings. They're just a fact. They have no conclusions, opinions, perspectives, judgments, either good or bad, or attributions. So if any of those things are what you're experiencing thinking, it's almost for sure is not a fact. Basically, everything that are not facts is stories. So the stories we tell, they define our feelings and our actions. And these stories then they can create a non-event. That would be the ignoring thing. Or they create a resentment. Or they create a need to forgive event. So to be practical, I want to be practical. So I want to talk about how this happens, kind of the process in it, and then what kind of things can you do about it? So consider the process. An event happens, and we instantly feel something, and we make a judgment, and we assign meaning to it, and a story is born. It's important to recognize that this feels like it just happens to us, to you, right? We don't feel like we have any part in it. They arise so quickly and so naturally that it feels like we are just experiencing reality. And so that's what we think. We think this is just reality. This is true. This is real. This is a fact. But it is a story. And forgiveness stories always have a main character. The main character, a villain. They also have supporting characters. Sorry, the victim, and the supporting character is the villain. And there's a common feeling. The common feeling is righteous anger for the victim who's been wronged. Now, most of the time, and particularly in forgiveness stories, we're talking about us being the victim. But it could be a righteous anger about some other victim. Sorry, I still got this technology. 2 buttons, it's really tough. And the villain deserves what? They deserve consequences. Because there needs to be justice for the victim, right? This is all part of the victim story. Because they should have known better. They should have, I mean, the rules apply to them, right? Like, they should have known better. And the story always assumes that because we know that the event is a true fact, this is reality, it's happened, that we are right and justified to judge. And we may even have an obligation to seek justice. So, quick review. So what happens? How does this occur? How does this forgiveness story occur? It occurs because an event happens. We assume our perception is true and actual fact, reality. And therefore we assume there really is a victim. There really is a villain. The rules actually do apply. We have a right to judge, and there needs to be consequences. If we don't forgive, we typically end up in resentment. And that produces more stories, more offenses, anger, supporting evidence, and we get stuck in this loop. And in the loop, I tried to show that, you know, it comes down, we have these things, these feelings and angers and stuff happen again, and it goes back into our story, and that creates, it in fact can even create more events. But if we can let go of any of our stories, assumptions, then the victim forgiveness story loses its validity, and we break this loop. Consider that if you can let go of even one of these assumptions, that the outrage, the feelings, the stories, the need for justice, revenge can be released. So how do we do this? So I want to give some practical ways to change the story. And the simplest way I know is by asking questions. So practical ways to change the story. Challenge and let go of assumptions by asking questions like, why might a reasonable, rational, decent person do this? So when something happens, so as an example, Dan gave an example of driving, and he says he's driving down the street and someone cuts him off, right? And immediately his brain starts making up stories like, oh, this guy is well, he wouldn't use any kind of bad words, but, you know, this guy is mean, or this guy is, you know, an awful person, or this guy's selfish, or this, you know, like, what is he doing to me, like, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So he makes up stories. But then he asks a question like this: why might a reasonable, rational, decent person do this? What other stories might be true? Well, maybe the guy has his sick daughter and he's rushing her to the hospital. Right? If we told that story, then all of the forgiveness stuff falls apart. Or what if this person has just had a very tragic event in their life, and they're not really all coherent. They're kind of lost in their grief or something. You know, like there's so many other stories. So when we ask a question like this, what it does is it helps us to avoid having the fundamental attribution error. Now, some of you probably know this, maybe all of you know this, so I'll just repeat it anyway. This is a proven, accepted aspect of the human species. All of us do this all the time, and that is that we attribute to others, we attribute their actions to poor character, right? But we attribute to our actions, external causes and good intentions. This is the norm. So when we ask a question like that, it helps us avoid falling into that error. Vince Antonucci spoke at the main congregation a few weeks back, and he shared a personal story of where he had resentment for someone, and he was asking God, how do I get out of this? What do I do? And he also found two questions that got him out of it. He asked, how does God love me? And he asked, what's it like to be them? In the STEP studies, in the inventory, there's a question that's asked, what part am I playing in this? What am I ignoring or not noticing about my role in the problem? And when we ask this question, it helps us to avoid another common error of human thinking, and that's called confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is a universal human trait to notice what confirms our existing beliefs, but not see the data and facts that don't. So it helps us to accept our own fallibility. Here's some other ones. What needs do we have in common? When you start looking at people as having needs that aren't being met, what needs are not being met for both of us? We're having conflict probably because there's some need that's not being met. And what perception or assumption would I need to change in order to see both of us as the Imago Dei? So the Imago Dei, it means the image of God. And if you know from Genesis, apparently we were created in the image of God. So how can I see another person, another being, instead of my enemy, instead of the villain? How do I see them as the image of God? And if we can see that, then we can focus on we can stop focusing on our differences and look for what's common. So here's an example from the Big Book, which is the AA Big Book on Resentment, page 67. When a person offended us, we said to ourselves, this is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? We ask God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick person. So what assumptions are challenged? All of them. They're sick, lost, unaware, suffering, needing healing. There truly is no villain or victim. They're not a villain, they're sick, right? And if they're not a villain, then there can be no victim. I'm not a victim. They didn't do something to me. The expectations and rules don't apply. We don't apply the same rules to people who are sick. We're not justified in having a righteous anger, therefore. Justice is not served by punishment. In fact, they need healing. And then we can recognize that our original perception of the event is not true, and we missed many facts. So, challenge and let go of assumptions. And here's a bigger question you could ask, particularly after you've gone through the other ones. What should I do right now to move towards what I really want? Now, of course, that kind of begs the question of what do I really want? And when you think about that, when we're in that state, a lot of times what we really want is to be right. Is that what you really want, to be right? To get revenge and punish them? Get restitution to make yourself whole? To feel vindicated? To retake your power? Could there be better alternatives? Maybe more noble goals, more rewarding outcomes, more beneficial outcomes for everyone? Maybe contributing to a better world? The Step 4 inventory process asks us to look at these things. They ask us to look at the event and say, who was the person? What was the cause? What was the effect? What was the damage? And what was my part? What I would challenge you to from this presentation is to take each of those and try to separate the facts from your stories about them. If you can get good at that, it's very powerful. So, going back to the original, I hope you can see why this is the title. It doesn't mean God doesn't want you to forgive. Of course, God wants you to forgive. But He would prefer that you have a way of thinking about this, separating the facts from stories, so you're not even in the need to forgive. Because forgiveness, having to forgive and having resentment, causes you suffering, and it's unnecessary suffering. You don't need it. So we're going to do a little video of a parable.
Once upon a time, there was a very friendly, loving giant. He had one eye that could see very clearly, and so he saw no issues with his seeing. His kingdom was an island called the Island of Forgiveness. The kingdom motto was, "Forgiveness frees you, resentment enslaves you." He saw clearly that it was more important to be free than right, and he knew his citizens would be much happier if they could only follow the motto. Now there was some magic in this land. For one thing, citizens magically appeared there whenever they had something to forgive. There was also some dark magic there. No one could see that there was no way off the island kingdom. That might not have been an issue, except that many there did not have the ability to live by the motto. Most of them tried really, really hard, but they just couldn't let go of things like knowing they were in the right and the other was in the wrong, being hurt unfairly, and that justice required punishment. There were consequences for wrongdoing in the land, and the giant was the ultimate judge. But for many, the consequences often seemed inconsequential and not fairly meted out. Some people were punished for insignificant stuff, and others got away with really bad stuff. So, many people were unhappy and carried resentment. Some even had resentment for the giant and his laws and mottos. On the other hand, some people were able to practice the motto so well that they were able to quickly forgive others even when they didn't deserve it. These people were generally much happier than the ones stewing in resentment. They could also forgive themselves for being imperfect and accept the imperfect kingdom with no offense. Now there happened to be one exceptional resident named Grace, who was the island's champion forgiver. And though she was very happy with being on the island, she was troubled by the people who couldn't experience it the way she did. But her satisfaction with her island home started fading the day she realized there was no way off the island. She climbed to the top of a tower with a telescope and saw another whole kingdom across the water. She couldn't understand it, but she saw people who never had resentment because they never felt a need to forgive. How could this be? She wondered if there might be an even better way of being happy without having to repeatedly be forgiving and being forgiven, feeling wronged and hurt, or that she hurt and wronged others, having to swallow pride and give up on justice. So she sat down to think this through. She thought about how the whole thing happens and concluded that it usually involves a pattern. An event led to a story, usually with a judgment, and the story included a perceived hurt or injustice or someone being taken advantage of or victimized. That led to anger or indignation or offense, and if not resolved, resentment grew. The story and the anger and resentment triggered a desire for justice, usually punishment or compensation. Or someone could choose to let it go and forgive. And in that thinking, it struck her that the principle of forgiveness required acceptance and adherence to a number of beliefs or assumptions that were required for the forgiveness pattern to exist. 1. Separateness. We have to view and believe others and things as separate. Otherwise, there would be no one or nothing to forgive. 2. We have to believe that there are rules and rights that everyone, or at least those that hurt us, must obey. If there are no natural or agreed-upon rules or rights, then there are no wrongs to forgive. 3. A belief that justice requires punishment, or consequences such as penalties or compensation. If there are no natural or agreed-upon consequences, then there are no consequences to let go of and forgive someone for. 4. And wouldn't the right to forgive carry with it some type of position from which forgiveness can be granted? After all, one who follows the rules is in good standing, but the one who did wrong has lowered their position and fallen below the standard. They are in need of being judged or forgiven. The higher position can be of any nature, for instance, legal, moral, ethical, business, social, relational, intimate relations, spiritual, etc. But if a person believes they are not in a higher position to judge or forgive, there might not be a need to forgive at all. 5. And it seemed obvious to her that, technically at least, the assumption of a person who is wronged means that they have been the victim of the other person or thing. If an act is a victimless crime, it means that no one is hurt, no wrong is done to any individual. 6. But the biggest awareness was that this system of forgiveness required people to believe that their story, their perspective, is true and right reality. They know the facts and have the correct, rational, reasonable assessment of the situation. But if they could consider that their position might not be true, might not be complete, that there might be different valid stories, then they might be able to see the event from a perspective that freed them from having a need to forgive. So she decided to try an experiment. She would place a telescope at various locations around the island where people could see the mainland section that didn't have the assumption. She placed 6 telescopes and put a plaque that suggested if they look and consider what they saw, they might be better able to practice forgiveness. It was a success. Some people looked through the first telescope and saw that we are all together in this crazy world hurtling through space, all made of the same stardust, all just trying to survive and make sense of things, find purpose. They could see that they may have acted the same if they had to live through and in the same situation as the wrongdoers. They could accept that we are all children of the same creation. From this perspective, they could let go. Other islanders couldn't see it that way. They just knew for true that certain people were different than them. But when they looked through the second telescope, they could see that some others didn't have the same rules and beliefs and rights as them. And so these islanders could understand that these others could behave honorably, but not based on the same obligations that the islanders held. This perspective was hard to hold, but some could do it, especially when they considered situations like a person having mental, emotional, or physical illnesses or certain type of traumas, or people who knew nothing beyond their very different culture and upbringing. They could see that these others were just following the rules to best of their knowledge and ability. And so these islanders were able to let go and forgive on this basis. Other islanders looked through the third telescope and were able to consider that maybe punishment cannot always satisfy justice. Maybe the best thing for everyone is to assess if some people who did wrongs may need help, healing, or education rather than punishment. Or if someone hurt someone because they didn't know the cultural expectations, maybe they didn't deserve to be punished for that. But that didn't work for everyone either. However, the fourth telescope made sense to some. For example, it made clear sense to some who believed that God was the only one in a position to judge, so they could let go and leave it up to God, or perhaps leave it up to the giant if they didn't have a belief in God. There was a group of very independent people who liked what they saw in Telescope 5. These islanders saw themselves as the masters of their own fate, and they always took 100% accountability for their results. So they could see that instead of a need to forgive others, they just accepted the situation as the reality they were accountable for, and then used it as a learning opportunity to consider what they could do different to achieve the results they sought. They didn't need to forgive anyone, not even themselves. The last group of people were able to look across and see that others were having pretty much the same experiences as them, but living entirely different stories. These islanders could see that what they had been seeing as facts might not, and probably were not, actual facts, but instead were conclusions, judgments, and stories they told themselves to justify their need to be right and support their identity as a good person. The view through Telescope 6 opened many doors for seeing the potential of all the telescope's views as challenging what they assumed as reality, and many were able to let go through this process. So, things generally improved, and more people were able to improve the quality of life for everyone on the island. But Grace still felt there might be something more. She thought, what if instead of telescopes, I built bridges across the water? Then people could escape the cycle of needing to forgive and for receiving forgiveness and live on the mainland. So she built anti-assumption bridges at each location. And sure enough, some people were able to leave the island altogether. Now, some could only stay away for a short time. Others could stay away for longer. But some never returned. And then, there were some islanders who couldn't accept that there could actually be a life without the need for forgiveness, and they were content to use the telescopes to help them. And some were just too skeptical, or cynical, or sure of being right that they wouldn't even look through a telescope. And they lobbied for the giant to ban the bridges. And some of these people carried resentment against Grace and the people who left, and for the giant for allowing all this chaos on their island.
So, just in case you read the first slide and then signed off because you realized, oh my God, that's not right. Of course we need to forgive. Let's be clear. We love forgiveness. Forgiveness is way, way better than unforgiveness or carrying around a grudge. But the idea here is to separate out those stories that you're telling yourselves from the actual facts and to give yourself the opportunity to be free from all the churn and energy expended on the other side of resentments. Amen? Amen.